The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. Hello and welcome to History Jackson, the home of accessible and digestible history. And welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series, where we'll be talking to some of the historians, living historians and performers here at Chalke about what they're doing at the festival and their work. Now, Chalke History Festival will be covered comprehensively through History Jackson, be it on our social media, our blog, and our podcast. So if you wanted to check out more and learn more about what's happening at Chalke, do head to the links in the description below. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you to our Chalke History Festival special series episode. Okay, so hello and welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series here on History Jackson, and we are joined by Jonathon Sumption. How are you doing, Jonathon?
I'm feeling fine.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast and excited to talk about some of the work you've done today at Chalke. So you've written an amazing volume of books on the 100 Years' War. What inspired you to start this series?
I'm afraid I've got a rather mundane answer to that question. When I was teaching at Oxford at the beginning of my career, I taught everything from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Reformation. But the only part of that where I was particularly in advance of my pupils was the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries. So by the time I left Oxford to become a lawyer, I was looking for a subject to write about, a historical subject to write about. I had my fill of the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, and the next thing was the 14th and 15th. So that's where I went.
I think that's a really nice story of how you came to write about it.
Most people have trivial reasons for choosing their subjects. It doesn't mean that they don't become seriously possessed by the subjects.
Do you feel that you've been seriously possessed by it?
Of course. Well, I mean, I've had to combine it with a night job. But yes.
And that, so why do you feel that we should study and learn about the 100 Years' War?
I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it lies at the origin of the Western European state system. It created as self-conscious nations England and France and Scotland, and arguably Castile and Portugal as well. These were the main battlefields. Secondly, I think that it is an important illustration of the way that human societies develop in a more general sense. War and religion have always, until relatively recently, been the two principal collective activities of mankind. And it's through war and religion that societies acquire some definable shape. The 100 Years' War involved the entire population of England and France in a way that no previous war had done. It involved a huge bureaucratic effort. We tend to think of it just in terms of soldiers going over and killing people, but actually it involved tax collectors, it involved coast guards, it involved administrators who went from port to port finding ships to carry armies. It involved people whose job it was to proclaim royal proclamations in street corners. Everybody was brought close to the war and close to the state by the experience of 120 years of war, which took up a very high proportion of the spare resources of both states. And that is essentially where their existence as states and as solid communities begins.
I think it's really fascinating seeing the shape and development of these nations. But England and France at this period were organised very differently as regimes.
At the beginning they weren't, but they were by the end.
And how does that affect the way that they mobilise their populations to help with this effort?
Well, the main priority of governments in dealing with their populations was to recruit soldiers. That wasn't too difficult, provided you could pay them. So more important was raising tax funds, taxable revenues. And taxation is the great test of the capacities of the state. Medieval societies did not have armies of inland revenue officials. They didn't have computers to record their tax liabilities. They were dependent on relatively crude methods of fundraising. And that was really the big challenge. The power of the state developed very differently in France and England, because in France the only way that the state was able to raise money was essentially by royal decree and varying degrees of force. In England the position was different, because there was a relatively sophisticated parliamentary system under which the consent of Parliament acted as the consent of the nation to the payment of taxes. It didn't mean to say that people didn't dislike taxes as much as they always have done, and sometimes resist their collection. But the word of Parliament was decisive, and Parliament's refusal to award taxes was also decisive. So Britain developed along much more parliamentary and constitutional lines than France, which emerged from the wars as essentially an autocracy, because it had had to become one in order to defeat the English. And that had implications for the whole of the future history of both countries. France became an absolute monarchy, not immediately, but over the following century, with an interval for the French Wars of Religion, which set back the French state for a long way, whereas England became a country in which a much more consensual style of government prevailed. Now that is a gross generalization, but it is a broadly correct analysis of the 3 centuries that followed the end of the wars.
And I'm really fascinated by how that changes, and you've brought that to us in a really accessible way. So thank you very much. Now, how does the changing borders and shape of English continental possessions affect their ability to mobilise and fight the French?
The English kings started the wars as the Dukes of Aquitaine, and that was where the war had begun. It was where most of the early campaigns were fought, but it was remote, and it was separated from northern France by a very difficult barrier to pass, namely the valley of the Loire. So it had to be supplied and manned by sea, which was a logistically difficult exercise. The English kings attached great importance to the conservation of their southwestern French domains, although they were never a useful source of either revenue or any other assets, really. They were a moderately useful source of manpower, but not really significant even in that context. The object, as far as certainly Edward III was concerned, was to restore the boundaries of Aquitaine to something like what they had been in the middle of the 13th century. And in that endeavour, he eventually succeeded, at least on paper, when the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was signed. But it was all illusory. The strategic weaknesses of England compared with France simply reasserted themselves after that, and all the territory gained was promptly lost. The 15th century wars were rather different, but Aquitaine was not very important in the 15th century. Not after Henry V's succession, anyway.
So, if the French lands of changing importance and various how does this conflict keep starting and stopping and lasting over 100 years?
Intervals, there were truces, and there were even peace treaties, none of which lasted. The trouble is that armies in the Middle Ages were not the docile instruments of the state that they subsequently became. They were recruited through independent contractors who raised troops to fight under their own command, and they were extremely difficult to control. They tended to recruit people locally who were a cross between soldiers and bandits who had their own agenda. So the fact that you'd made peace or agreed a truce did not mean that the battlefields went silent. There was an attempt to enforce the truce, but basically all these truces broke down in the end, sometimes quite soon. The only definitive solution was for the French to remove the English from France altogether, which is what they did in the 1450s.
And seeing the loss of English control over France is really interesting in the process of that, how that happened. But you've mentioned how the Hundred Years' War.
Financial exhaustion is the main reason why it happened. The English had succeeded earlier because, although their resources were smaller than those of France, they were better at collecting them, and because the French were divided by serious civil wars for much of the period covered by the 100 Years' War. When those conditions ceased, as they did in the 15th century, the English didn't have a chance. The revenues of the King of France at the end of the 100 Years' War were at least 4 times those of England, and their resources of manpower were much greater. It was the population of France was 2 or 3 times that of England. The civil wars were brought to an end, not definitively, but certainly for the last few years of the war, so that all the advantages that the English had, allies within France, a more efficient system of revenue collection, disappeared.
And how does the role of Burgundy and the Great Slump in that period affect English and French interests and finances?
Well, the Great Slump affected English finances primarily because the English public revenues were derived to a very large extent from customs duties, so that trade boycotts and the recession in the wool trade seriously damaged English public revenues. You asked me about the effect of the slump, and then something else.
Burgundy.
Oh, Burgundy. Well, Burgundy, the secession of the Dukes of Burgundy from France and their alliance with the English after the murder of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was what enabled the English kings to have a plausible dab at becoming kings of France, an ambition which had been totally unrealistic and was probably never seriously entertained before that. It was seriously entertained after the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, in which the French king, who was mad and under the control of the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke of Burgundy himself basically signed up to a transfer of the crown from the Valois dynasty to the English Lancastrian dynasty, and the disinheritance of the Dauphin, who was judged correctly, in fact, to have been connived in the murder of John the Fearless. That was what transformed the fortunes of Henry V. It didn't last, essentially because although the English and their Burgundian allies succeeded in asserting control over most of France north of the Loire, they were never able to make their power felt south of the Loire, partly because the Loire is a very difficult strategic barrier to cross. It's a wide river which before embankment was even more difficult to cross than it is now. It was defended by crossing points which were very heavily fortified. So that was the first reason. The other reason why they never succeeded in making their power felt south of the Loire was that the Dauphin, and after he became king, Charles VII, he enjoyed the services of an extremely able generation of French civil servants who succeeded in setting up a new state with exact replicas of all the institutions of Paris, which was occupied by the English, from capitals in Poitiers, which was the judicial capital, and Bourges, which was the administrative and financial capital of Valois, France. Once they had succeeded in organizing their own state south of the Loire, the idea behind the Treaty of Troyes, which was that the whole of France would simply drop into Henry V's lap, became unrealistic. It became unrealistic even before the death of Henry V at a very young age put the lid on the whole plan anyway.
So does a lot of this conflict rely on the strength of personality of some of its key figures?
Only in the sense that the personality of Henry V was clearly a critical factor in his success, and he was greatly admired by many Frenchmen. One reason why a lot of French people accepted the Treaty of Troyes was that they reasoned that Henry V, with Burgundian support, was going to win anyway. He seemed to be better at running a state than the mad King of France and his discredited son, the Dauphin. So basically they wanted security. A well-known French sage, Jean Juvenal, who was a legal counsellor of the French king, said that that for most Frenchmen, they were perfectly happy to live under any state that was capable of giving them security, even, he said, if the king were a Muslim. Had less resonance in the 15th century than it does now.
That's incredibly interesting to see how those different strengths of Henry V and Charles play a role in this. But this has been a huge part of your life, this 100 Years' War collection.
Yes, it's been. I mean, I've done other things as well, but it's been a preoccupation for a long time.
Who is your favourite character that you have written about across the course of the volumes?
I don't have a favourite one. They were almost all pretty rebarbative figures. I mean, Edward III and Henry V were both extremely successful warriors, but they were bastards, both of them. And frankly, I wouldn't have wanted to go on a walking tour without them. So, you know, a favourite character is just not a concept that helps. I think, in a way, the most interesting of many colourful personalities of the period is Joan of Arc, because of the extraordinary achievement for which she was responsible. She did transform the fortunes of the war. I think they would have been transformed eventually anyway, though possibly more slowly. But she made an immense difference. She persuaded the French troops that they could win, which they hadn't previously been convinced about.
And she's an awe-inspiring figure.
Joan of Arc, she didn't command armies. She wouldn't have been capable of it. And she didn't actually fight. She carried a sword, but she told her judges during her trial that she'd never, ever killed a man. And indeed, she said she carried her banner in her right arm so that she would be incapable of killing somebody with the sword that she in fact carried in her scabbard. But what she did do was she threw herself into the most dangerous part of the battle and survived. And, you know, people seeing that began to take seriously her view that she was an agent of God. And that makes a difference if you think you're supported by God, and if that's more than just the sort of figure of speech that it tends to be. You tend to fight harder.
And it relates to what you were saying about religion being an important part of this conflict.
Yes, to some extent it does. But the Count of Dunois, the greatest French commander of the 15th century, when he gave evidence in the judicial inquiry into Joan of Arc's life after the wars were over, said that basically before she turned up, it took 4 Frenchmen to overcome any Englishman. The French armies had to be 4 times the size of an English one to defeat them, whereas afterwards it was the other way around. And curiously, this view of things is more or less borne out by English sources. There are two in particular. The interrogation of prisoners of war revealed that most of them thought that something terrible had happened to them and that it was Joan of Arc's doing, and that their morale simply faded away. And the Duke of Bedford, the English regent of France, one of the ablest English captains of the period, said much the same when explaining the catastrophe to the council. In 1434, he said when everything was going fine until this daughter of the devil came along. And at her trial, both sides were agreed that she had supernatural powers. The difference was between the defense, which said that they came from God, and the prosecutors, who said that they came from the devil. The English believed that something incomprehensible and supernatural had happened to them. Well, Napoleon, in one of his many hectoring letters to his brother Joseph, said that in war, morale is 3/4 of the business, and manpower is only 1/4. I doubt whether you can put it in statistical form, but the life of Joan of Arc very much bears that out.
Well, thank you very much for. I've never heard of those accounts, and it's very interesting to see how she's being presented in those primary sources. But I have a final fun question for you, Jonathan. Now we're at Chalke History Festival. It's an incredibly hot and warm day. You can hear some medieval music playing. What are you most excited about going to look at and learn about today at the festival?
Well, I've had a day which has been filled with either appearances at one of the sessions or interviews with people like you, and so I haven't actually been to anything else at all.
Oh,
I'm sorry about that.
no, that's all right. No,
So, I mean, it sounds very self-obsessed, but I haven't had time to think about anything but the next thing on my program.
oh, well, I thoroughly recommend going to.
I'll try.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on. And how can people grab a copy of your books?
Then in Waterston's.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on.